It began this morning, Turkey launching a military assault in Syria that they'd been telegraphing for a day or so against a Kurdish fighting force that has been a critical ally of the United States and that U.S. troops have been working alongside for the past 5 years. This assault today, which started in Syria, comes 4 days after President Trump made this no warning surprise announcement that he would order U.S. troops pulled back from that part of Syria, basically to allow Turkey to do what it wants there. We got a report tonight from the region that Kurdish families tonight are fleeing the city of Kobani. Specifically, they've been fleeing to what has been a nearby U.S. military base. Because even though President Trump has ordered U.S. troops to basically abandon our Kurdish allies, those Kurdish families in Kobani feel like they have nowhere else to go, nobody else to turn to. And so even with this policy change, they are still, as they flee their city, seeking out the U.S., or at least seeking out that U.S. base in search of American protection. Joining us now is Wendy Sherman, former Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs in the Obama administration. Madam Ambassador, it's a pleasure to have you here tonight. Thanks for your time.
Good to be with you, Rachel.
So I have a layman's understanding at best of the forces at work here. So I wouldn't, if you wouldn't mind, if we could just start with you setting me straight on this surprise U-turn decision by President Trump and what's happened since. Let me just ask you if I got any of that wrong.
No, I think you laid it out quite well, as usual. What's happening here is the president, to use his own words, in his great and utmost wisdom, has put the United States on the side of a genocide that is likely to take place in the days ahead. There's word tonight from the Washington Post. David Ignatius is reporting that, in fact, there will be both a ground and an air assault that will start again within the next 24 hours, and it will be relentless. As you pointed out, the Russians are working with Turkey on this assault. And it is going to be just utterly appalling, so appalling that it has gotten bipartisan support for sanctions against Turkey in the United States Senate. It seems to be the one place where the senators can agree.
As far as I understand it, and again, I reserve the right to be wrong here because I find this to be difficult to get current information as this is starting to change so quickly. But as far as I understand it, there are about 1,000 U.S. troops in Syria. With what's happening there now, especially with what you're reporting, or what David Ignatius is reporting about what may be about to happen in terms of the escalation here, I have to ask about the safety of U.S. troops in this environment, including given the rules of engagement in which they are operating there, but also the question of whether or not those U.S. troops are in any continuing position to offer any protection, any shelter, any help in the case of mass civilian casualties or even a genocidal effort, as you describe.
Well, I think this is a terrific question and a very concerning one because the president really doesn't want American troops to have anything to do with this and has said American troops have nothing to do with this. And indeed, only about 50 to 100 troops are being pulled out of northern Syria to allow Turkey to move in and go forward. So indeed, we still have a lot of troops there. And although the president's trying to tell his followers that he's getting all the troops out of Syria, in fact, he's not. And what he's done is green-lighted Turkey, green-lighted Russia, and really given a present to Vladimir Putin, who, as you implied and pretty much stated, is trying to get a foothold in the Middle East, show that the United States is not a reliable partner, and make common cause with Turkey, a NATO ally, an ally of the United States of America, an ally, however, that recently bought an air defense system from Russia and not from us.
In terms of that Russian interest, obviously the Turks have had it out for the Kurds for a long time. And so Erdogan wanting to go in there and attack Kurdish forces is something that we can understand in terms of his direct interests and what he has telegraphed for years and the way that Turkey has behaved, frankly, for decades. In terms of the Russian interest here, though, I mean, I understand that Russia sees Syria as effectively its outpost or its sort of lily pad in the Middle East. I don't clearly understand why Turkey and Russia would set aside their differences about the Syrian civil war to effectively work together here. Why this gift to Turkey would simultaneously be a gift to Russia?
Turkey is working very hard to have it all ways. Iran is a neighbor of Turkey's. They got an air defense system. Turkey did from Russia, as I noted. So Turkey's playing a very sophisticated geopolitical game here, trying to make sure that it takes care of all of its interests. And Russia, who really, Putin doesn't have a particular yen except for whatever is in his own personal interest, sort of like the President of the United States. So if it works to make common cause with Turkey to gain control of a part of Turkey or have an interest in a part of Turkey, part of Syria that it never had before, they're all in for the operation.
Wendy Sherman, former Undersecretary of State, MSNBC contributor. Wendy, thank you very much for being here. I really appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you.
All right, more ahead tonight. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.